What's up, everybody? I'm coming at you today to share with you my testimony. What does testimony mean? I'm not even sure, but the way I look at it is I look at it as a story. So I'm going to tell you my story on how I went from atheism, that's a belief that there is no God, to Christianity. I think my story is a little bit unique in the sense of growing up, my dad considered himself Muslim and my mom was Christian. I say was because she passed away when I was younger. If you don't believe in God, I invite you to hear me out because it may get you thinking in a little bit different of a way. If you do believe in God, I want to share with you a fatal flaw in the way that I looked at the world, and I believe many people of faith have that same flaw. I do want to say that I've had so much resistance making this video. Just really bizarre things happen. I'm not like a superstitious person, or I'm not one of those people that kind of talk like that, but I mean, just earlier, my cat was literally just going crazy outside, which she never really does. Then I'm getting like insects biting my feet up like crazy inside my house, which I don't have a problem with. My phone's acting weird. Anyway, who knows what's going on? I'm gonna try my best to muscle through this video. We'll see what happens. Okay. I'm going to start when I was a young whippersnapper. Okay, when I was in 5th grade, that's when it all kind of really started for me. When I was in 5th grade, I started to really wonder about what's going on in the world. What's the truth? What's the right religion? Is it my dad? He's Muslim. Was it my mom? Christian. Or is it something else? I don't know. So I began my journey on investigating, okay? Religion took up a significant amount of my thinking because that was on my mind. I wanted to know what the truth was. Now, crucial to the story is my relationship with school. When I was a young kid, I was always good at taking tests. So whenever I would take a test, I would typically get about 100. I might miss one. I was so good at taking tests that they skipped me ahead of grade. I think I skipped maybe 2nd grade, something like that. So that's the situation. I'm really good at taking tests. And in my mind, the way I thought about it is, okay, if I take the test and I get 100, then that shows that I know the information. Homework is just there to kind of make sure I know the information. So I didn't really see a point for homework, at least for myself, because I could just get a 100 on it anyway. At the same time, this might seem really weird, but when I was in 5th grade, I took an inventory of my life and I put things in perspective from the sense of I knew that I was just a little kid. And I compared myself to adults. I would look at adults and I would see them working and I would see them not really having that much fun. They weren't playing outside. I was playing outside. I'm having a great time in my life because I'm just a little kid. So I concluded that childhood is precious and I need to take advantage of childhood as much as I can. And homework's just getting in my way because when I'm home, that's my time to just play outside and I know the information anyway. So I made a commitment. I said, I'm not doing any more homework. I'm not recommending this. I'm not even saying what I did is the right thing. I'm just sharing with you what actually happened. So when I was in 5th grade, I just decided not to do any homework. And when I go home, I'm just going to play outside. When I was in the classroom, I told myself, hey, I'm going to participate. I'm not going to be disruptive. I'm going to do the work while I'm in class. But when I go home, that's like, hey, I'm off of work now. That's my time. Somehow, some way, I ended up passing 5th grade. I don't even know how I ended up passing, but I ended up passing. So I'm trying to create some context here. Religion is on my mind a lot in 5th grade. I don't know what's going on. I'm kind of researching, I guess you could call it, talking to people of different faiths. I'm reading as many books as I can on the topics. Somehow I pass and I go into 6th grade. Same thing there. I'm not doing any homework, so my grades are trash. I'm still thinking about religion a lot. I'm thinking about what's going on in the world. Who's right? is there a God? I'm not sure. I'm dabbling with these deep questions. Somehow I pass 6th grade and I make it to 7th grade. In 7th grade, that's when I end up concluding that God is just a fantasy for adults. Okay? I looked at religion as just serving two main purposes. Religion is there to explain things that we cannot explain, and it's also there to keep people in check. You know, somebody a long time ago just created these stories. They said, hey, you know, if you do bad things, you'll go to hell. If you do good things, you'll go to heaven. And it really seemed very fake to me. And at that point, I was very surprised that so many people bought into it. Okay, that's where my mind was when I was in 7th grade. I didn't really express it. I wasn't really talking to people about it because I was kind of like in the closet. I was afraid if I let it be known I didn't believe in God, that I'd be like an outcast, a weirdo. So I kind of kept it to myself. Now, my grades were trash again in 7th grade, so much so that I ended up failing. I failed the 7th grade. Now try to put yourself in my shoes, okay? You know, you're in middle school. I'm in middle school and I fail. Man, that's a big deal because I have all my friends and everything and they move on. So now I'm no longer hanging out with them in my class. They're going to 8th grade. And now I got to meet all these new people and everything. So here I am in 7th grade for the second time. Same thing though. My philosophy is, hey, I know the information because I'm good at tests. Thus, I don't need to do the homework. Plus, childhood is precious. So when I went home, I was having a great time. I was going to the pool, playing basketball. That was my life at home. As a result, my grades were trash, and I found myself in a position to fail the 7th grade for a second time, which is totally unacceptable. I cannot let this happen. So I decided to bite the bullet and just do the work so I can end up passing. But I didn't kind of know where I stood. So I remember going into the counselor's office and I talked to her. I said, hey, listen, I want to pass the 7th grade. What do I need to do? And I remember her going one by one each of my grades. She said, okay, Paul, well, in mathematics, if you were to do all your work and you got a 100 on everything and you were to get a 100 for your final grade, we would average that with your other grades and you would get a 42. 70's passing, so I would get a 42, meaning if I got a 100, I still wouldn't pass math. So then she went to the next thing. Well, Paul, in science, if you were to get a 100, it would average out to a 35. I'm making up the numbers, but in essence, that's what was happening. She was going one by one, and I had no shot. Actually, the only shot that I had was in history. She said, look, if you get a 100 in history, it will average out with all your other grades and you'll get a 70 exactly. So meaning I basically have to be perfect to get a 100 just so I can get a 70, just so I can move on and pass and just qualify for summer school really is what it was. And I remember talking to her, I remember saying, okay, so I only need to focus on history, right? That's the only thing that matters. And she said, no, you need to do your other work because you got to bring your grades up. And in my mind, I was like, what's the point? I'm not going to expend energy on these other grades when I have no shot. All I have to do is focus on history. So that's what I was thinking in my mind. So I left that office and I thought, from this point on, I'm going to just focus on history. And that's what I did. I started just studying. I started doing everything, double checking all my work because I wanted to make sure that I got a 100 on every single thing that I did because I was afraid that if I missed one, my overall grade would end up being a 99 and I would end up failing. So I needed a 100 on everything. So I would double check everything. I would overstudy. I would do all my homework. That was my life. History, right? Now get this. It all comes down to the final exam. The final exam is going to make or break me. I need a 100 on it in order to average my grade to a 70 so I can move on to 8th grade. Okay, so the stakes are very high. There's a lot of pressure. I studied a lot, but still, you never know with the test. And I remember that day. I remember sitting at the desk, and I received the worksheet. I don't know what you call it. It's got all the questions on it. And then I received the Scantron. That's where you put your answers. And I just had them in front of me, and I bowed my head kind of like I was doing the work. I had my head down like this, but I was praying. Now remember, at this point in the 7th grade, I had concluded that there was no God. I looked down on people that believed in God and religion and all that because I thought it was all super fake. But nevertheless, I decided to pray anyway. So here I am. I have my head down and I'm praying. In my mind, I'm saying, God, please, please, God, if you're there, if there's anything there that can hear me, God, please bless me to get a 100 on this test. I need to get a 100 on this test, God. If you give me a 100, I will never doubt you again, God. I will never doubt you again if you give me a 100. Give me a 100, God, and I will never doubt you again. And I pray like that. On and on and on for about 15 minutes with my head down, just praying. Because again, I didn't want to fail the 7th grade for a second time. Praying, God, please, please, like this. And I remember opening my eyes and I decided to do the test, and I opened the worksheet, and inside I see the answer key. So I had an additional paper there that had all the answers on it. So right away I'm like, what the heck? What's going on? And I'm looking around confused. I take the answer key and I slide it behind the worksheet that has the questions on it. And I decide to just take the test. I'm going to take the test and not even look at the answer key. That's what I did. I looked at the question, read it, marked it on the Scantron. I don't know how many questions that were on it, but it was a pretty long test. Now I'm done with the test. I decide to look at the answer key that I had and double check my work. So I kind of slide it a little bit, looking around, and I check all my answers, and I realize that I would have missed one question. Okay? So I would have ended up failing the 7th grade. What I did is I changed it because I had the answer key. And then I got up and I had the answer key. My teacher was there. I didn't want her to know that I had it. So I just slid it in some files that were on her desk, and then I gave my test there. So I ended up passing. I got a 100 on the test, and I made it to 8th grade. Now, this story does not influence me at all from a religious standpoint. It doesn't bring me any closer to God. I ended up rationalizing that experience away. And that's what I'm going to explain later on what I mean by that. So anyway, I still don't believe in God. I'm in 8th grade now. I'm starting to become a little bit more vocal about it. More firm in my stance that God doesn't exist. I make it to 9th grade. I make it to 10th grade. At this point, I start to experience some things. I start meeting some people, and I start realizing that I'm not the smartest person. I may be good at taking tests, but there's many forms of intelligence. Somebody might be really good at making music, and I just don't have an ear for that. Their brain is developed in that way. They're more intelligent from that perspective than I. So I started to wonder, maybe I don't have it all figured out. Maybe I'm wrong about God. So I went from atheism and I put myself in more of an agnostic perspective. Agnostic is kind of a wishy-washy stance of you don't know what's going on. Maybe God exists, maybe God doesn't exist. My stance, though, inside, even though I called myself agnostic, I was really like 99.9% sure that God wasn't real, especially organized religion. I still had a lot of, probably resentment and a lot of internal things going against religion. But I considered myself agnostic because I thought maybe I'm wrong. Probably not, but who knows? Okay, so now I end up, out of high school. I'm still thinking about religion, okay? My mind starts to open a little bit. I start to not have such a firm belief that God doesn't exist, okay? One of the main turning points in my life is I actually came up with a mathematical equation on why I think God must exist, at least a very superficial version. Look at that. My cat's going crazy again. Remember I talked about that resistance? I'm going to make this video. I don't care what happens. Okay, so long story short, it's pretty simple in my approach. Basically, I looked at space. So you have space that moves internally. You have space that moves externally. Within space, you have probability of certain things to arise. I forgot if I said this already or not, but I looked at life as just being a freak coincidence. Because there's so much space, eventually something like life will arise. I end up taking that logic a step farther and just think, okay, well, you have infinite space going out, infinite potential space going inward, and then, now in pop culture, you have all these like multi-dimensions and everything, the multiverse and all that. Regardless of how you look at it, you have all this space for different things to happen. So eventually there would have to be some kind of superpower that would arise. That's at the very top, that just transcends everything, transcends space. God is everywhere, transcends time, meaning God has always existed. This is a very superficial kind of stance on God, at least that's how I look at it now, but at that time that was my foot in the door to believing in God. Because at that point I came to the conclusion that God must exist. From just a probabilistic standpoint, there must be at least that version of God. So I was more open. I didn't know, does God have a relationship with me? Does God hear me? I looked at God as being in everything, so I thought God could hear me, but I didn't know if God cared. Was he indifferent? I don't know. The attributes of God were unknown at this point. Now, some other things about my life that are important to the story is, and this is going to sound super fake and weird, but I was obsessed with physics. Coming out of high school, that's what occupied my thoughts. Other people are thinking about a lot of other things. They're thinking about girls, or thinking about getting married, a job, college, this, that, or whatever. I wasn't thinking about any of that. I was just thinking about physics. I was thinking about what's going on in the world. I thought I could figure it out. I thought I was going to be like the next Einstein. I know that sounds absurd, but I spent so much time. That's how I spent so much of my time, was learning about physics. You have general relativity, you have electromagnetism, you have nuclear weak, nuclear strong forces. So there's this divide there. Those forces don't quite line up. I thought I was going to be the one that brings it together. And I thought, if I did that, I thought the whole universe would make sense. I thought that my life would make sense. I thought that there'd be, I achieved the apex of understanding, and there, boom, that's it. That was my pursuit, was physics. At the same time, I went down a road of being very anti-materials, like very non-materialistic. I'm not going to go into detail on how I arrived at these conclusions, but just a brief synopsis. I would kind of look at people in my life that had achieved mass wealth, and they achieved it through shady means, many of them. So I took that and I imprinted that on other people, and I assumed if you had a lot of money, you were just a shady person. That, or you were just selfish. Like, what do you need a big house for? What do you need a nice car, a bunch of cars? Just live within your means, just be humble. So I had a lot of judgment towards wealthy people, and I decided to move away from that. So, lots of people are trying to get a promotion or get a job to make more money. I was so anti-materialistic that I was planning on being a homeless person. I know that sounds insane, but I just didn't want to have anything to do with money. Factor that in with the fact that physics were just occupying my thoughts. It was getting to a point where I was not being able to kind of relate to people. People were just going about their lives, watching shows, this and that. That's all I could think about, physics. Okay, now this is where the story gets weird, and if it's not already weird, right? I'm just gonna come out and just say this. I had a very acute experience. If I remember correctly, I think I might have been around 24 years old, 25. I don't remember exactly, but I felt the presence of God. I felt like God basically came down to me and started explaining things to me. I know that seems fake, and hey, just look at it as a story. I believe that what happened to me was real. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about the story, primarily because in that moment when I felt God's presence, He explained to me that what was happening to me, this story, this situation, was for me. It was meant to transform my life. It's not meant to transform your life, okay? He didn't tell me that I cannot tell the story. That's why I'm going to kind of share it with you today. But he just said, it's not meant to change anybody's opinion on whether or not I exist or whatever. I'm just going to kind of brush over it a little bit and give you some main takeaways from that moment. The first thing that I realized is that God exists and that God loves me. Amazing. Like, I know it sounds corny if you don't believe in God and it seems super fake. If you've experienced God's love, you know what I'm talking about. God loves me so much, more than anybody else in the world. And He loves you in the same way. And that might seem like a contradiction, but God's love is just vast, so vast. I also realized that I had been duped. I realized that Lucifer is a real entity. Because before that, when I was looking into physics and I was going down the road of, going away from materialistic means, I always thought that if God did exist, if the devil did exist, it would be a great thing for me. Because if the devil existed, that means that God must exist. But I knew that the devil didn't exist because I was smarter than that. The devil couldn't trick me, but in that moment I realized that I had been duped and I had been tricked, and that the devil does exist. Many things were explained to me, most of them in great detail. So for example, Christianity. Christianity is the ultimate form of truth. And I know that may be offensive and you might be wondering about what about all the other religions. If you want to have a conversation with me about that, we can talk more about this. I could talk about this moment and just specific parts of it forever, but I don't want this video to run on super long. Anyway, I realized in that moment that Christianity was true, that Jesus is real. Because before I thought, Jesus, that just sounded so stupid to me. God? Is it God? Is it a man? He explained that to me very simply. He said, hey, I can do pretty much anything, so I came in the form of man. I came in the form of man for your sins and also so that you can relate. You might have watched my prayer videos. I learned how to pray in that moment. God explained to me how to pray. So anyway, I learned many things. A couple of the big things that changed my life, of course, just knowing that God exists and how to pray, those were huge, transformative ideas that God put into my mind. But He also let me know that my pursuit for knowing everything through the means of learning about physics was futile. He said, hey, listen, I can amplify your intelligence by 1 billion trillion, and you'll still have no idea what's going on in the world. So He didn't tell me that I should stop learning. He said, you can learn if you want, but just know you'll never know everything. So that, when I came out of that moment, that put me on a different trajectory in my life, because at that moment, it freed me of this idea that I could learn everything and know everything. He also let me know that it was okay for me to have money. and that it was okay for me to have a lot of money if I wanted to. He just let me know, don't achieve wealth through in unethical ways. But that's okay, you can have money. That was another thing that transformed my life. Coming out of that moment, I didn't even know what to make money for. I had to sit there and really think about it. What do I want money for? Because I was so used to not wanting it or not trying to pursue it. And the first idea that I came up with was just being able to go to the grocery store and buy healthy foods. Because before that, I had a hierarchy. The hierarchy was my happiness is top level priority. From there, it is my health, because if I'm healthy, I'm more likely to be happy, and then having a good social circle. In that moment, I realized that God takes priority over everything. My happiness, my health, all of that. Now, interestingly enough, when you align yourself with God and you put God as the foundation of your life, those things end up normally improving anyway. Okay? So, I'm in the moment. God lets me know that I'll doubt him the next day. Okay? Now, I'm just going to put that experience aside. Like I said, I could talk about that experience for a very long time. But now the next day comes around, and I started to experience exactly what he said. He said that I would doubt him. And I started to doubt that experience that happened to me. I started to rationalize it. I started thinking, well, maybe what happened was growing up, I might have heard some Bible verses, maybe from my mom, maybe talking to people of faith, and those things implanted themselves into my subconscious brain. And for whatever reason, in a moment, all those things ended up bubbling to the surface. And my mind made sense of the information that it was getting, and I just went into this mode of feeling like I was experiencing the presence of God. But in reality, I was having like a mental breakdown or something like that. So I ended up rationalizing it away. Or I was down the road of rationalizing it away, but I remember what God explained to me. He explained to me how prayer works, and he explained to me that he uses physical means to bring into effect his will and also answered prayers. Now, to rewind, to go back to that moment where I was taking the test, I want to relate this because this was the flaw that I was telling you about earlier as far as how I looked at the world. Because when I got out of that test and I passed, I immediately rationalized it. Because in my mind, God could not exist, or God doesn't exist. So I had to make sense of the situation. So I thought to myself, okay, there's two main possibilities on how this could have happened. One is it could just be a big coincidence. Maybe just by some freak accident, I somehow got the answer key. Okay? God didn't do it. It was just an accident. Another possibility is somehow, maybe when I went to the counselor and I expressed my position, in some bizarre twist of fate, she decided to take it upon herself to talk to my history teacher, which I was under the impression that no one knew, no one ever said anything, but maybe she went to her and, going against policy probably, talked to her, and then my history teacher decided to give me the answer key. Both are bizarre and highly unlikely, but they're still explainable. And that's what I wanted to share with you guys, is just because something can be explained doesn't mean that it nullifies or cancels out the prayer. Because in that moment, I was praying, God, please, please bless me to get a 100 on the test. I'll never doubt you again if I get a 100 on the test. And then what happened? I got a 100 on the test. And then what happened? I doubted God, right? Now look, this could have gone many different ways. It's interesting when I think about it. One way that it could have gone is that I could have just ended up getting a 100 with no answer key, right? Then what would have happened? I would have immediately just said, I did it, of course. I studied, I got a 100, okay? Another possibility is I could have looked at the answer key, put it away, did the test, then checked my answers, and then realized I would have got a 100 anyway, so it didn't matter. So I still did it. But the situation was I would have missed one, so I needed that answer key, okay? Now, how that answer key wound up in front of me doesn't matter. That's what I learned in that moment from God, is it doesn't matter how that answer key showed up. The bottom line is it did show up, and the bottom line is I did get a 100. Doesn't matter if it was an accident. It doesn't matter if my history teacher put it there or some other explanation. All that matters is that I had the answers and that I got a 100 on the test. Even if I didn't have the answer key and I got a 100, it's still an answered prayer because that's what I prayed for. I prayed for a 100 and I received a 100. Now, the causality chain, what happens before that, I look at God working through that to answer prayers. And I see this in many people who believe in God. They pray for something to happen. Let's say your dog is missing. God, please bless it so that I find my dog. And then your neighbor shows up and they have your dog. And then right away in your mind, the thought goes away that God was involved in that. Because there's an explanation. Oh, my neighbor found my dog. So that's a main takeaway. So if you guys don't believe in God, or if you do believe in God, if you decide to pray to God and that thing happens, I want you to remember that just because you can explain it does not nullify, cancel, or negate that prayer. Now, I will say this. Again, I came out of the moment. The next day, I doubted God. I started to rationalize it away. But I remembered what He told me. I remembered how He showed me how to pray. So I decided to pray. And that was one of my first prayers, as I guess you could call me a Christian at that point, is I prayed for faith. Maybe I was a very shaky Christian because I didn't know what to believe at that point. But I prayed for faith. And what followed was a series of miraculous coincidences. I'm not going to go into detail those things, but I will say that coincidences would happen. Let's say something would happen, 1 in a 100 chance, but that thing would happen. So I would start to rationalize it away like I described to you before. I would make sense of it, right? I'm like, well, that's not God. That's just, I would look before and see how it happened. But then I remember, no, this is how God works through things. So then I would pray again and then something else would happen. And then again and again and again and again and again and so on. To the point to where I just had to surrender. And I had to just give my life to God because God was there. God gave me faith. That's what I asked for. I asked for Him to come into my heart. And I wonder, why did that happen to me? Because a lot of people don't have acute responses from God in that way. And I don't think that I'm special, because a lot of people, sometimes they'll say, oh, well, it's because you're special somehow, Paul. In some ways, we're all special, but in another way, I feel like I needed it because I was so arrogant and so firm in my stance. It wouldn't matter what was shown to me. I was not going to believe in God no matter what. Even when God came into my life and my brain and showed me information, which, by the way, later on ended up being perfectly congruent with the Bible. These things, like, how did I receive that information in that moment? There's so many bizarre coincidences that happened along the way that I just surrendered to God. And that's the best thing that's ever happened to me. The best thing. And if you don't know what's going on in the world, I understand, because, it's confusing, especially with the media and all that. And this sounds like conspiracy theory talk, but I do believe that there is a dark force, Lucifer, that is manipulating and tricking people. And I invite you to consider, if you don't believe in God, that just maybe, that you might be tricked like I was. And it's not complicated. Really, all you got to do is just orient your heart, because it's not about evidence, really. At least it wasn't for me. There are some people that end up receiving God through evidences. And that's great. I admire people like that. If you look at the evidence is completely on that side. I know that sounds completely unrealistic, especially if you don't believe, but the evidence is there. But it doesn't matter what the evidence is. If your heart isn't oriented in the right place, you at least have to have an open heart. And at that moment in my life, when I felt the experience of God, I believe that it was the most open that I ever was. I acted like I was open before that. Like I acted like I was open. Oh, well, if God existed, I would follow him. But in reality, that wasn't true, because I had so much resentment towards God if God did exist. And I had so many issues, and I really didn't want to know the truth. I was lying to myself. These are all things I understand now. So if you're in a position to where you don't know and you're curious, I invite you to pray like I did. Pray for faith. Pray out. Hey, is there anything out there that's listening? If there is, please come into my life and give me faith in you. I invite you to pray that with an open heart. That's important. And I believe that if you do that, that God will reveal himself to you. But you have to be open to it, and you have to realize about the causality chain, meaning that what you're praying for will end up happening, but it will make sense. Just because it makes sense doesn't mean that God isn't working through those things. And remember that if you believe in God. Remember that when you pray for things, if that happen, you got to give glory to God because he's working through those things. That's it for my story, guys. I made it. Yes. Anyway, thanks for listening. If you got this far, if you have a testimony that you think is interesting or that you want to share, I would totally be down to talk to you, on the phone or meet up for coffee or something like that. I would like to hear your story. That's it for the video, guys. God bless you all. Peace.